November 20th, 1759. Admiral Edward Hawke is chasing the French Atlantic Fleet into Quiberon Bay on the Brittany coast. A full gale is blowing, 40-knot winds, heavy seas, rain squalls reducing visibility to almost nothing. The bay ahead is a death trap, uncharted rocks, treacherous shoals, a hostile shore lined with French batteries. Hawke's officers are begging him not to follow the French into those lethal waters. 21 French ships of the line are running for the imagined safety of the bay, confident the British would never be mad enough to pursue them into such danger. They're about to discover they're catastrophically wrong. In the next 4 hours, Hawke will destroy France's last naval hope, end the invasion threat to Britain, and secure British naval supremacy for the next century. He'll achieve all this in conditions so terrible that simply keeping his ships afloat is a victory. This is the story of how one commander's audacity won an empire in a single afternoon. If you want to discover how impossible victories happen, hit that like button and subscribe. The year 1759 would be remembered as Britain's Annus Mirabilis, the year of miracles. But it hadn't started that way. The 7 Years' War had dragged into its third year, with Britain fighting France across 4 continents, bleeding treasure, and men with little to show for it. Then, suddenly, everything changed. In July, British forces captured Fort Niagara, opening the path to Montreal. In August, Admiral Boscawen destroyed the French Mediterranean fleet at Lagos off Portugal. In September, General Wolfe took Quebec in a battle that cost him his life, but gave Britain Canada. In Germany, British and Allied forces crushed the French at Minden. Victory after victory, each one building momentum, each one tightening the noose around French power. But France still had one card to play, and it was the most dangerous one imaginable: invasion. 50,000 French troops were assembled at Vannes and other Channel ports, ready to board transports and cross to Britain. The plan was simple and terrifying: land overwhelming force on British soil, march on London, force surrender before British armies could concentrate. It had nearly worked in 1588 with the Spanish Armada, and the memory still haunted British strategic thinking. An invasion meant French soldiers burning English towns, French cavalry ranging through the countryside, the very real possibility of national extinction. Everything depended on naval supremacy, even if just for a few days. The French needed to control the Channel long enough to get their army across. Without that, the transports would be sitting targets for the Royal Navy. With Boscawen's destruction of the Toulon fleet in August, France's last hope rested with their Atlantic fleet based at Brest. 21 ships of the line under Marshal de Conflans, a competent if unimaginative commander. If Conflans could break out, rendezvous with the invasion transports, and escort them across the Channel, the war could turn on a single desperate gamble. Britain's counter-strategy was straightforward: blockade Brest, keep Conflans bottled up, prevent any junction with the invasion fleet. Admiral Edward Hawke commanded the Western Squadron assigned to this task, and he'd been doing it for months. Close blockade in the 18th century meant keeping warships at sea in all weather, constantly watching enemy ports, ready to pounce the moment the enemy sailed. It was brutal, exhausting work. Ships and crews deteriorated under constant exposure to Atlantic storms. Sails tore, rigging snapped, crews fell ill from wet and cold. Captains had to balance vigilance against the simple physical limits of wooden ships and human endurance. By mid-November, Hawke had been maintaining the blockade for weeks straight. His ships needed rest, his crews needed shore leave, and winter storms were making station-keeping increasingly dangerous. The Admiralty was pressing him constantly: prevent the invasion, whatever it takes. William Pitt, the Prime Minister driving Britain's aggressive war strategy, made clear that failure wasn't acceptable. Hawke understood perfectly what was at stake. If Conflans escaped and reached the invasion fleet, thousands of British civilians might die. If Hawke lost ships maintaining an impossible blockade, he'd be court-martialed for negligence. On November 14th, a massive storm hit the western approaches with winds that made blockade impossible. Hawke had no choice. He ordered his fleet to ride out the gale at sea, driven eastward away from Brest. In that window, Conflans saw his chance. The French fleet was putting to sea, and Hawke had no idea they'd gone. Edward Hawke was 64 years old in 1759, which made him ancient by the standards of active fleet command. Most admirals his age were enjoying comfortable retirement, attending Admiralty meetings and collecting pensions. Hawke was at sea in Atlantic gales because he'd spent his entire adult life proving that aggressive action won wars, whilst caution merely prolonged them. Born in 1705 to a respectable but unremarkable family, he'd entered the Royal Navy as a volunteer and risen through ability rather than aristocratic connections. By the 1740s, he'd established himself as the sort of officer who got results, which meant he received the difficult assignments nobody else wanted. His defining moment had come in 1747 at the First Battle of Cape Finisterre, where he'd commanded a squadron intercepting a French convoy. The accepted naval doctrine of the era was the formal line of battle, ships arranged in neat formation, engaging enemy counterparts in gentlemanly parallel lines, with victory going to whoever could maintain formation longest whilst trading broadsides. Hawke had looked at this system and decided it was designed to avoid defeat rather than achieve victory. When he spotted the French convoy, he'd ignored the sacred line entirely and ordered general chase. Every ship pursue the enemy at maximum speed, attack as you catch them, devil take the hindmost. His captains had been shocked, then exhilarated when the tactic worked brilliantly. The French formation shattered under the aggressive pursuit, and Hawke captured most of the convoy. The Admiralty had been scandalized. You couldn't just abandon proper formation until they saw the results. Hawke was promoted to Rear Admiral and quietly given command of increasingly important squadrons. His reputation grew as the officer who won battles rather than merely fought them competently. Old Hawke, his sailors called him, with the affection professional seamen reserved for commanders who achieved victories without wasting lives unnecessarily. He was physically robust despite his age, with the weathered face of a man who'd spent decades at sea. His command style was direct, almost blunt. He told subordinates what needed doing and expected them to find ways to do it. What made Hawke unusual among British admirals was his willingness to accept calculated risks that terrified his contemporaries. Most officers had been trained in a cautious tradition that valued preserving ships above destroying enemies. Losing a ship of the line was a career-ending disaster, possibly a court-martial offense, so admirals played safe. Hawke understood something deeper. Wars were won by destroying enemy capability to resist, and that sometimes meant accepting losses to achieve decisive results. He wasn't reckless. He calculated odds, assessed capabilities, and made cold decisions about acceptable costs. But he would risk his ships if the strategic prize was worth it, which made him dangerous in ways enemy admirals struggled to counter. His relationship with subordinate captains was built on mutual respect and shared understanding of his methods. They knew Hawke would put them in desperate situations, but never stupidly. They'd follow him into danger because experience proved his judgment was sound, his tactical instincts reliable. When Hawke ordered something that seemed insane, his captains had learned to trust there was method behind the apparent madness. That trust was about to be tested beyond anything they'd experienced before, because the decision Hawke would make on November 20th would seem not just risky, but suicidal. And he was about to make it without hesitation. November 14th, 1759. The storm that had been building for days finally hit with full force, and Hawke's western squadron was scattered eastward by winds that made maintaining position off Brest physically impossible. Ships ran before the gale under bare poles, no sails at all, just the hull driven by wind alone, trying to stay afloat whilst the Atlantic tried to tear them apart. For Conflans, watching from Brest Harbour, this was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. The British blockade was gone, blown away by nature itself. If he could get his 21 ships out now, whilst the British were scattered and struggling, he'd have perhaps 2 days' head start before Hawke could reorganize and pursue. The French fleet put to sea that same day in conditions that were only marginally less terrible than what had driven Hawke off. Conflans's ships were fresh from harbour, fully supplied, crews rested, every advantage except experience fighting in weather like this. His plan was straightforward. Sail south to Quiberon Bay, where the invasion transports were waiting, embark the troops already assembled there, then escort the convoy to the mouth of the Loire, where the main invasion army waited. Once concentrated, the combined force would attempt the Channel crossing, hopefully before British forces could intercept. It was ambitious, possibly desperate, but France was running out of options. This invasion was their last realistic chance to knock Britain out of the war. Conflans had one enormous advantage he was counting on: local knowledge. French pilots knew every rock and shoal around Brittany's treacherous coast. Quiberon Bay was notoriously dangerous, a maze of rocks, shoals, and strong tidal currents that made it deadly for any ship without expert pilots. If the British somehow pursued him, Conflans was confident they'd never follow into the bay itself. It would be suicide for foreign ships in those waters, especially in a gale. He'd be safe there, could organize the convoy at leisure, then choose his moment to sail north. For 3 days, the French fleet made its way south along the Brittany coast, staying close to shore where their pilots' knowledge gave them safety. The weather remained atrocious: gale-force winds from the west, heavy seas, rain squalls reducing visibility. Conflans' ships were handling the conditions reasonably well, though several had damage from the constant pounding. By November 19th, they were approaching Quiberon Bay. The Admiral was probably feeling cautiously optimistic. The British were still scattered somewhere to the west, probably regrouping at their usual station off Ushant. By the time they discovered the French had sailed, Conflans would be safely in the bay with the transports. Then, at approximately midday on November 19th, French lookouts spotted British frigates on the horizon. These fast, small warships were Hawke's eyes, scouting vessels that stayed in contact with the enemy and sent intelligence back to the main fleet. Their presence meant something terrifying. Hawke knew the French had sailed and was already in pursuit. Conflans immediately ordered increased speed. If he could reach Quiberon Bay before the British main fleet arrived, he'd still be safe. His pilots could guide French ships through the maze of rocks. The British would never follow. What Conflans didn't know was that Hawke had received the frigate's intelligence the previous evening and had immediately ordered his entire fleet, 23 ships of the line, into pursuit at maximum speed. The race was on, and Conflans was about to lose more than he could possibly imagine. The British fleet had spent November 19th and 20 driving south under every scrap of canvas their ships could carry in near-gale conditions. This wasn't normal sailing. This was controlled violence. 40-knot winds pushed the massive ships at speeds that stressed every timber and rope to breaking point. Sails tore regularly, requiring frantic work by topmen who climbed swaying masts 100 feet above a heaving deck to secure flapping canvas before it ripped completely. Masts groaned under the strain, the sound audible even over wind and waves. Below decks, gun crews braced themselves against the violent motion, trying to sleep in hammocks that swung like pendulums whilst water seeped through closed gun ports. Hawke's flagship, HMS Royal George, led the pursuit. At 100 guns and nearly 2,000 tons, she was one of the largest warships afloat, but even her massive bulk pitched and rolled in the Atlantic swells. Hawke stood on the quarterdeck, utterly unconcerned by the spray soaking him, or the wind that made verbal orders nearly impossible. He'd spent half a century at sea and had experienced worse weather, though not often. What mattered was maintaining speed. Every hour of delay gave Conflans time to reach safety and organize the invasion fleet. The British ships were handling the conditions better than the French would have managed, and Hawke knew it. His crews had spent months at sea on blockade duty, working their ships in all weather, maintaining constant readiness. The French had been in harbour, resting comfortably, but losing the edge that came from constant practice. Ship handling in heavy weather was a skill maintained through experience, and Hawke's crews had that experience in abundance. They knew their vessels intimately, how each ship responded to helm and sail, what strains she could endure when you were pushing too hard. By dawn on November 20th, the British fleet was approaching the French coast. Lookouts spotted land through the murk, the rocky shores of Brittany, as hostile to foreign ships as any coastline in Europe. Navigation here required constant vigilance. Charts of this coast were unreliable at best, and the French had excellent reasons not to survey and publish accurate ones. British captains were sailing into poorly mapped waters, in a gale, chasing an enemy who knew every hazard. The professional calculation said this was already beyond acceptable risk. Then, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, British lookouts spotted the French fleet ahead. Conflans' ships were making for the entrance to Quiberon Bay, visible as a gap between rocky headlands. The distance was closing rapidly. The British were sailing faster, their superior seamanship showing in the way they carried more canvas safely. Within an hour, the leading British ships would be in gun range of the French rear. Conflans had run out of sea room. He had to make his choice: turn and fight in open water, where the British advantages in gunnery and ship handling would dominate, or run for Quiberon Bay and rely on the rocks to protect him. Conflans chose the bay. His signals ordered the fleet to enter at maximum speed. Once inside, the British would never follow. They'd be insane to try it in these conditions without local pilots. The French admiral was about to discover that Edward Hawke's definition of insanity was very different from his own. The British fleet was steering straight for the bay entrance, and they weren't slowing down. At 2:30 on the afternoon of November 20th, Edward Hawke stood on Royal George's quarterdeck, facing the decision that would define his career and possibly alter the course of the war. Ahead, the entrance to Quiberon Bay was clearly visible, a gap between rocky headlands that led into waters no British fleet had ever entered in combat. His officers were gathered nearby, their faces showing the strain of what they were witnessing. The French fleet was streaming into the bay, and every professional instinct these experienced captains possessed was screaming that following them would be suicide. Quiberon Bay was roughly 15 miles across at its mouth, but that width was deceptive. Beneath the surface lay a nightmare of rocks and shoals, some marked by breaking waves, others lurking invisibly just below. Tidal currents ran at speeds that could carry a ship onto rocks before the crew realized they were in danger. The western shore was hostile French territory, lined with batteries that could fire on any British ship that ventured too close. Worst of all, the British had no detailed charts. French pilots had spent careers learning these waters. Hawke's navigators were sailing blind. Captain Campbell of HMS Royal George spoke first, his voice carefully respectful but urgent. "Sir, the bay is uncharted. In these conditions, with the gale still building, we could lose half the fleet on rocks before we even engage the French." Other captains murmured agreement. These weren't cowards speaking. These were experienced professional officers stating tactical reality. Following the French into Quiberon Bay in a November gale without local pilots was the sort of decision that ended careers in court-martial and disgrace. Hawke listened to their concerns, then looked at the French ships disappearing into the bay. Conflans was confident those ships were safe, that British caution would protect him better than any shore battery. The French admiral had made his calculation based on reasonable assumptions about British behavior, that they'd value their ships above decisive victory, that they'd choose safety over risk. In that calculation, Conflans had made a fatal error. He'd assumed Hawke thought like other admirals. "Gentlemen," Hawke said, his voice carrying despite the wind, "you have shown me the danger. Now let me show you the necessity." He gestured toward the French fleet. "Those ships are France's last hope of invading Britain. If they reach the transports and embark the troops, thousands of our countrymen may die on British soil. If we let Conflans escape because we feared rocks, we'll answer for it when French soldiers land in England." He paused, then delivered the reasoning that would become legend. "You tell me the bay is dangerous, and the rocks will sink us. I tell you the rocks are equally dangerous to French ships as to ours. If they can sail these waters, so can we." The signal went up Royal George's halyards. General chase. Every British ship was to pursue the enemy into the bay at maximum speed. There would be no careful reconnaissance, no waiting for favorable conditions, no cautious approach. They were going in now, in a gale, chasing the enemy into the most dangerous waters in France. Hawke's captains looked at the signal, looked at their admiral, then began shouting orders. If the old man said they could do it, they'd do it. They'd followed him before, and he'd never led them wrong. The British fleet turned toward the bay entrance, and there was no going back. At 3 o'clock, HMS Warspite and HMS Dorsetshire, leading the British van, crossed into Quiberon Bay and immediately engaged the French rear. The gale was still blowing at full force, 40-knot winds pushing massive ships sideways as they tried to maneuver into firing positions. Gun crews on both sides faced challenges no amount of peacetime training could prepare them for. The ships were heeling so heavily that the lower gun ports, normally 6 feet above the waterline, were dipping into the waves. Opening those ports in these conditions meant water flooding the gun deck, but closing them meant losing half your firepower. Captains made instant decisions. Lower guns stay closed, fight with upper deck batteries only. The French Formidable, an 80-gun ship of the line, found herself cut off from the rest of Conflans' fleet and surrounded by 3 British ships. Her captain, Saint-André du Verger, tried to claw his way toward the protection of the main French formation, but British gunnery was devastating, even in the storm conditions. Warspite closed to less than 100 yards, point-blank range where you couldn't miss. Her broadside smashed into Formidable's hull, each 32-pound iron ball punching through oak planking and erupting into storms of splinters that killed and maimed gun crews. Formidable tried to return fire, but her crews were less practiced, their rate of fire slower. The bay itself was chaos. Visibility was perhaps half a mile in the rain squalls, meaning ships suddenly appeared out of the murk at close range. Conflans' fleet, which had entered the bay in some semblance of order, was scattering as individual captains realized the British were actually inside the bay and fighting. The French admiral's plan, such as it was, had depended on the British staying outside. Now his ships were fighting individually, trying to avoid rocks whilst engaging enemy vessels, with the wind and current pushing them deeper into the bay toward even more dangerous waters. At 3:15, something happened that crystallized the French nightmare. Thésée, a 74-gun ship, was engaged by HMS Torbay when a massive wave caught her beam on. The ship heeled violently to starboard, and water poured through her open lower gun ports in a catastrophic flood. Within seconds, Thésée was listing at a dangerous angle. Her crew tried desperately to close the gun ports, but it was too late. The weight of water inside her hull was dragging her over. Men on deck could feel the ship dying beneath them, the sickening sensation of a vessel losing her fight against the sea. Thésée capsized completely, rolling turtle with her masts hitting the water and her copper-sheathed bottom visible above the surface. 400 men were trapped inside or clinging to the hull. In the storm and chaos of battle, there was no possibility of rescue. British ships sailing past couldn't stop. They were in the middle of a battle in treacherous waters. Within minutes, Thésée sank completely, taking virtually her entire crew to the bottom of Quiberon Bay. The French were learning that Hawke's audacity had turned their sanctuary into an execution ground. British ships were accepting the risk of rocks because they understood something Conflans hadn't considered. In these conditions, the greater danger came from the enemy's guns. And the slaughter was only beginning. Between 3:30 and 4:30, Quiberon Bay became a vision of naval hell. The storm was reaching its peak intensity, waves breaking over ships' quarterdecks, wind shrieking through rigging with a sound like tortured souls. Yet through this natural violence, British ships pursued their French counterparts with relentless determination, firing broadsides whenever they could bring guns to bear. The combination of battle and tempest created conditions beyond anything in the experience of most crews on either side. French Superbe, a 70-gun ship, was overwhelmed by HMS Resolution and HMS Montague working in coordination. Caught between two enemies and unable to maneuver effectively in the confined waters, Superbe took broadsides from both sides simultaneously. Her hull was shattered, masts toppled, and she began taking on water faster than her pumps could handle. Within 30 minutes of the engagement beginning, Superbe rolled onto her beam ends and sank. 650 men went down with her. Survivors clinging to wreckage in the storm-tossed water had virtually no chance. The same British ships that had just destroyed them couldn't stop to rescue survivors while still fighting. Conflans' flagship, Soleil Royal, was engaged by Hawke's Royal George in a duel that should have been decisive, but was frustrated by the chaotic conditions. The two massive ships, Soleil Royal mounting 80 guns, Royal George 100, traded broadsides at ranges that varied from 300 yards to less than 50, as wind and current pushed them together and apart. Hawke personally directed Royal George's fire, standing completely exposed on the quarterdeck whilst round shots screamed overhead and splinters flew from impacts. Soleil Royal was taking tremendous damage, but Conflans managed to maneuver deeper into the bay, using his pilot's knowledge to navigate toward shallow water where Royal George's deeper draft couldn't safely follow. French Héros fought HMS Magnanime in a savage close-range action that saw both ships badly damaged. Other French vessels were making desperate decisions. Juste and several others deliberately ran themselves aground on the shore, their captains choosing to wreck their ships rather than risk capture. At least on the beach, their crews could escape with their lives. Several British ships pursued so aggressively that they too went aground, including HMS Resolution, which struck a shoal with a grinding crash that could be heard even over the battle noise. Her crew worked frantically, and miraculously, the rising tide would eventually float her off with minimal damage. HMS Essex wasn't so fortunate. Pursuing French ships into the shallow eastern section of the bay, she struck rocks that ripped open her hull. Water poured in, and despite every effort by her pumps and bucket chains, Essex was doomed. Her captain ordered the crew to abandon ship, and they made it to shore just before the vessel broke apart completely. It was a total loss, but at least most of her crew survived. By 4:30, daylight was failing. The November afternoon was giving way to darkness, and fighting a naval battle in these conditions at night was impossible. Ships couldn't distinguish friend from enemy. Navigation became guesswork. The risk of collision was overwhelming. Hawke ordered his fleet to anchor where they were, inside Quiberon Bay, without pilots or charts, in the middle of a gale. His captains executed the order, dropping anchors in hostile waters they'd entered for the first time just 2 hours earlier. Around them, visible in the gathering darkness, were the broken remains of the French Atlantic Fleet. Dawn on November 21st revealed the full scale of what had happened. As light spread across Quiberon Bay, British crews could see the devastation surrounding them. Wrecks littered the bay, ships broken on rocks, masts protruding from shallow water, hulls smashed and listing on beaches. French Héros was aground on the western shore, her crew having escaped during the night. Conflans' flagship Soleil Royal sat aground at the mouth of the river Vilaine, damaged and abandoned. The French admiral had transferred to a frigate in darkness and escaped upriver, leaving his fleet's remains scattered across the bay like broken toys. British crews were discovering something remarkable. Despite having fought a fleet action in uncharted waters during a gale, they'd navigated safely. Ships were anchored throughout the bay, many within a few hundred yards of rocks that should have destroyed them, yet they'd avoided disaster through seamanship that bordered on miraculous. Lookouts posted throughout the night had called out warnings. Captains had maneuvered on instinct, and somehow the British fleet had survived circumstances that should have wrecked them. The French hadn't been so fortunate. Final tallies showed 7 ships of the line destroyed or captured. Thésée and Superbe had sunk during the battle with catastrophic loss of life. Over 1,000 men drowned between them. Formidable had struck her colours and was now a British prize. Héros and Soleil Royal were aground and beyond salvaging. 2 others were wrecked on rocks. 8 more French ships had escaped into the river Vilaine, but they were trapped there. The river was too shallow for ships of the line to navigate without extensive work, removing their guns and stores to lighten them. Those vessels were effectively removed from the war, bottled up in a river they couldn't leave without months of effort. French casualties exceeded 2,500 killed, drowned, or wounded. British losses were roughly 300 to 400 casualties, and 2 ships, Essex destroyed on rocks, Resolution temporarily grounded, but refloated. By any reasonable measure, Hawke had achieved one of the most one-sided victories in naval history under some of the most difficult conditions imaginable. The strategic consequences were immediate and total. France no longer possessed an Atlantic fleet capable of challenging British control of the Channel. The invasion army assembled at Vannes was disbanded. Without ships to transport and protect them, 50,000 soldiers were worse than useless. They were a drain on resources France couldn't afford. The transports waiting in Quiberon Bay were either destroyed or captured. The entire invasion plan, France's last desperate gamble to knock Britain out of the war, collapsed within 24 hours of Hawke's decision to enter the bay. Conflans was destroyed professionally. Technically, he'd lost the battle because he'd run away rather than fighting in open water, then lost his fleet because the British had followed him into waters he'd assumed were safe. The French court blamed him for the disaster, and his career ended in disgrace. He'd made the fatal mistake of assuming his opponent would act rationally by conventional standards, and Hawke had taught him that conventional standards meant nothing when strategic necessity demanded otherwise. As British ships began working their way out of Quiberon Bay over the following days, Hawke could survey what he'd accomplished. In one afternoon, he'd ended France's naval power, secured Britain's shores from invasion, and guaranteed British naval supremacy for the remainder of the war. Not a bad day's work for a 64-year-old admiral everyone said was too old for combat command. The news of Quiberon Bay reached London on November 23rd, carried by fast dispatch vessels, and the city erupted in celebration that made previous victory announcements seem muted by comparison. Church bells rang across the capital, bonfires were lit in every square, and crowds filled the streets singing and cheering. This wasn't just another tactical victory. This was deliverance from existential threat. The invasion that had haunted British nightmares for months was finished, ended by a 64-year-old admiral who chased the enemy into hell and emerged victorious. The strategic consequences rippled outward through the war. French naval power in the Atlantic was shattered beyond any hope of recovery within years. Their shipyards could eventually build replacement vessels, but trained crews and experienced officers couldn't be replaced quickly. The institutional knowledge lost when Thésée and Superbe went down. Hundreds of skilled seamen, gunners who knew their craft, officers with years of experience, represented a blow France wouldn't recover from during the war. British naval supremacy was now uncontested, and that supremacy translated directly into strategic dominance across the globe. French colonial trade collapsed under British blockade. Sugar islands in the Caribbean, unable to receive supplies or export their product, saw their economies crater. French trading posts in India faced British pressure without hope of reinforcement from Europe. Canada, already falling after Quebec's capture in September, would be completely isolated when the campaign season resumed in 1760. The 7 Years' War would continue until 1763, but Quiberon Bay had effectively decided its outcome. Britain would dictate peace terms from a position of overwhelming strength. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 reflected this reality. Britain gained Canada, Spanish Florida, numerous Caribbean islands, and dominance in India. France was expelled from North America entirely and reduced to minor colonial status. The global balance of power had shifted decisively, and that shift began on a stormy afternoon in Quiberon Bay, when Edward Hawke made a decision that seemed insane, but proved to be genius. Hawke himself was rewarded with promotion to full admiral, honours from a grateful king, and eventually elevation to the peerage as Baron Hawke. The public adored him. Songs were written celebrating Hawke and his brave tars. Street ballads recounted the battle in increasingly mythologized versions, and Heart of Oak, the march that would become the Royal Navy's official anthem, was composed specifically to honor British sailors' courage at Quiberon Bay. For a brief moment, Hawke was as famous as any military hero in British history. His tactical approach became doctrine for the Royal Navy. The cautious, formal line-of-battle tactics that had dominated naval warfare for decades gave way to Hawke's aggressive pursuit philosophy. Younger officers learned that preserving ships mattered less than destroying enemies, that calculated risks won wars, whilst excessive caution merely extended them. A young captain named Horatio Nelson, born the same year as the Battle of Quiberon Bay, would grow up in a Royal Navy shaped by Hawke's example. When Nelson shattered the French and Spanish fleet at Trafalgar 46 years later, he'd be applying principles Hawke had demonstrated in Quiberon Bay. For the next century, British naval dominance was unchallenged. The Pax Britannica that allowed Britain to build a global empire rested on foundations laid by officers like Hawke, who'd proved that British ships, British seamanship, and British audacity could defeat any opponent. Yet somehow, despite achieving all this, Hawke's name would fade from popular memory, whilst others became legends. The Battle of Quiberon Bay should be as famous as Trafalgar, yet mention it to most people, and you'll get blank stares. The reasons for this historical amnesia are complicated, but reveal much about how we remember military history. Trafalgar, fought in 1805, became the defining British naval victory in popular consciousness. Nelson's dramatic death at the moment of triumph, the complete annihilation of the Franco-Spanish fleet, the famous signal, "England expects that every man will do his duty." It's a perfect story, almost mythological in its structure. The hero who sacrifices himself to save his nation. Victorians built that story into national identity, erecting statues and monuments, teaching it in every school, making Nelson synonymous with naval excellence. Hawke had the misfortune of surviving his greatest victory. There's no tragic death, no dramatic final words, no martyrdom to build mythology around. He fought the battle, won decisively, sailed home, and lived another 22 years before dying peacefully in his bed at age 76. That's wonderful for Hawke and his family, but terrible for historical memorability. We remember heroes who die young more readily than those who grow old. The nature of the battles themselves shaped their different legacies. Trafalgar was fought in open ocean with clear visibility, producing a coherent narrative. British fleet in 2 columns breaking through enemy line, decisive engagement, enemy fleet annihilated. It's easy to visualize, easy to paint in heroic murals. Quiberon Bay was messy, fought in a storm, inside a treacherous bay, with ships scattered across miles of water, some sinking from weather as much as enemy fire, others running aground deliberately. It's harder to create a clean narrative from chaos, harder to reduce to the simple story that embeds in cultural memory. Location mattered too. Trafalgar was fought off Cape Trafalgar in southern Spain. Dramatic open ocean battle. Quiberon Bay is a specific location on the Brittany coast that most British people have never heard of and certainly couldn't locate on a map. The geographic specificity made the battle harder to mythologize. It was that fight in that bay, rather than a battle that could represent naval warfare generally. Historical timing played its role as well. By the Victorian era, when British military history was being codified and taught, the Napoleonic Wars were recent enough to have veterans still alive, but distant enough for romantic mythology. The 7 Years' War was a century past, overshadowed by the later conflict. Educational curricula focused on Nelson and Wellington, the heroes who defeated Napoleon, whilst earlier conflicts received less attention. Quiberon Bay became a footnote in histories focused on the Napoleonic period. Yet naval historians and military professionals never forgot. The Royal Navy taught Quiberon Bay at its academy as an example of decisive command, calculated risk-taking, and the aggressive pursuit doctrine that became service tradition. Officers studied Hawke's decision to enter the bay as a masterclass in weighing strategic necessity against tactical risk. Nelson himself studied Hawke's tactics and explicitly modelled his own approach on Hawke's aggressive principles. The historical profession recognized Quiberon Bay as arguably more strategically significant than Trafalgar. It prevented invasion rather than confirmed existing dominance, and it did so under far more difficult conditions. The injustice is that popular memory forgot what professionals always knew. Edward Hawke's victory at Quiberon Bay was one of the most audacious, strategically decisive naval actions in history. And it happened because one old admiral refused to accept that dangerous waters meant safety for his enemies. What can we learn from an afternoon in 1759 when an elderly admiral chased his enemies into a death trap and won anyway? The lessons go far beyond naval tactics and speak to fundamental questions about leadership, risk, and when to break the rules everyone else follows. Hawke understood something crucial about calculated risk that separates great commanders from merely competent ones. The rocks in Quiberon Bay were equally dangerous to French and British ships. That was the key insight. Conflans assumed British caution would protect him, that Hawke would value ship preservation over enemy destruction. But Hawke had done the mathematics differently. The strategic prize, destroying France's last Atlantic fleet and ending the invasion threat, was worth accepting tactical risks that would normally be unacceptable. He wasn't being reckless. He was being coldly rational about what the strategic situation demanded. This principle applies far beyond 18th-century naval warfare. In any competitive situation, the opponent's assumptions about your behavior become vulnerabilities you can exploit. Conflans had built his entire plan around the assumption that British ships wouldn't follow into Quiberon Bay. When that assumption proved wrong, his entire position collapsed. The lesson isn't to be recklessly aggressive, but to recognize when conventional caution serves the enemy's interests more than your own. Leadership matters enormously in these moments. Hawke's captains followed him into the bay because decades of experience had taught them his judgment was sound. He'd proven repeatedly that his aggressive tactics produced results, that he didn't waste lives unnecessarily, that his calculations were reliable. That trust, built over years, meant they'd follow orders that seemed insane when coming from a commander without his track record. Trust isn't built through single actions, but through consistent demonstration of competence and care for subordinates' lives. The human element proved decisive. British crews handled their ships better in terrible conditions because they'd spent months at sea maintaining constant readiness. The French had rested in harbour whilst the British practiced. When crisis came, muscle memory and experience made the difference between disaster and triumph. There's no substitute for training, for maintaining skills through constant practice, for building the institutional knowledge that lets organizations perform under pressure. Hawke's willingness to accept British losses to achieve strategic objectives also teaches hard lessons about command. Essex was lost on rocks. Hundreds of British sailors died or were wounded, and Hawke accepted this as the necessary cost of destroying enemy capability. Modern sensibilities recoil from such cold calculation, but warfare hasn't changed. Strategic victory sometimes requires accepting tactical losses. The question isn't whether to take risks, but whether the objective justifies the cost. Nelson learned these lessons directly from studying Hawke's career. The aggressive pursuit at Trafalgar, the willingness to break formation and attack decisively, the focus on destroying enemy capability rather than fighting by established rules, all flowed from Hawke's example. The Royal Navy that dominated for a century after Quiberon Bay was shaped by officers who'd internalized Hawke's principles. History forgot Edward Hawke's name, but not his lessons. Every time a commander chooses audacity over caution, accepts calculated risk for strategic gain, or exploits enemy assumptions about safe behavior, they're applying principles Hawke demonstrated in Quiberon Bay. One afternoon in November 1759, a 64-year-old admiral proved that rules exist to serve victory, not to prevent defeat. Sometimes the path to triumph runs straight through the dangers everyone else avoids. If you learned something from this forgotten battle, share it in the comments. Hit that like button if you believe audacity and skill can overcome impossible odds. And subscribe, because history is filled with commanders who achieved the extraordinary by refusing to accept the limitations others assumed were absolute. Edward Hawke deserves to be remembered alongside Nelson, and now you know why.